Once you've ruled out the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true.
And it is not a question of a little occultism or a touch of mysticism, Mr. Denton. It is vampires, and there's a host of damned souls at Pelham House.
I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night.
Here, the old gods are dead.
And what of the true God?
He's dead. Can't complain.
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
You're listening to Paranormal UK Radio.
Welcome to the Paranormal UK Radio Show, the flagship show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Irene Allen Block, and with me, once again,
She forgot my name again. Anyway.
Mark Johnson.
That's my name, isn't it? Mark Johnson. I think that's my name. Is that my name? I think that's my name.
Yes, it is
my
your
name. Okay. How are you, Irene?
How am I? Well, you know I gave up smoking, don't you?
Now, I wanted to double check with you. It's been a few weeks now. Have you still not given in to the cravings?
No, I'm doing great. But I'm not getting what I should be getting. I'm not getting...
Fat?
Oh, sorry?
Fat? People gain weight when they stop smoking.
Oh, don't tell me that. For God's sake. But people said that I would be coughing. I'm not coughing. People said that I will bring up all this junk off my lungs. I haven't been doing that. And people said that my taste would change. And I would taste food differently. No, nothing's changed, Mark.
That's strange. Well, maybe your body, you were smoking for how many years?
God, 50 some odd years.
Yeah. Maybe your body is just going to take a little bit more time and then it's going to hit you all at once.
Shush.
Like the double whammy of coughing and phlegm.
Oh, God, give it up. Oh. No, honestly, I'm coughing less than what I was when I was smoking. I'm not coughing at all. Well, no, I'm not coughing at all. And I'm hardly using my asthma pumps.
But that's a good thing right there. You're not using your asthma pumps.
No.
Well, so let's continue. Let's monitor the situation and see how it proceeds.
And I'm not losing my temper, and I'm not getting fidgety, and I'm not getting all the other signs that I'm meant to be getting. And I have not smoked now for over 3 weeks.
Well, I can say that your temper isn't any worse than it normally is.
Ha ha. All right then. Up yours.
Well, I'm really happy for you after all this time. I know you've struggled with it for years and years, but this, I
didn't have any willpower. That was the problem. I didn't have any willpower. Every day I would say, I'd go to bed at night and I'd say, right, tomorrow morning I'm going to get up and I'm not going to have a cigarette. And then I would get up and I know I was a habit smoker. I know that. And as soon as I had my first cup of tea, then it would kick in. I could never smoke. I was not one of these that could smoke as soon as I got out of bed. If I didn't have a cup of tea until 11, 12 o'clock in the morning, I wouldn't have that cigarette until after that cup of tea. I could go that long.
Well,
but it was only the fact that I had this very, very bad cold virus a few weeks ago that managed to make me stop. And I am proud of myself. I really am.
Well, I'm very proud of you. I really am, because I know how bad you were smoking and how often you would light up whenever we would be talking. And I was really worried about you. And, but this is good, even though it's kind of late. You should have probably done this years ago. It's better late than never.
Yeah, you're right. But I've also, like I said, I'm proud of myself, and I did promise myself a new handbag and a pair of shoes if I could keep this up for another 4 weeks.
So now you got to make Brian take you out shopping.
Gucci. Gucci, here I come. Yeah. First of all, I'd like to give a shout out for Lee Beat and his family who live in Birmingham. Lee tells me he's a big fan of the show and him and his family listen to it. And we want to thank them for tuning in. Lee, we really appreciate it.
Lee, thank you very much. Then keep on listening. We have a great show tonight, but before we introduce our guests, we do want to make an announcement, and we're going to be talking about this as we continue on.
Do it, Mark.
Yes, for the next few weeks. We are looking for you, for the average people, you listeners out there. We are looking for your stories. Any of you who have had a strange encounter with the unknown, whether it be you've seen a ghost, or maybe you've dreamed, you woke up and you saw an angel and had an angel encounter. Maybe you've somebody who's seen a Bigfoot. Anyone who's had experiences with aliens or other otherworldly creatures, or just you had an experience that is just so strange you can't even classify it. We are looking for your experiences for an upcoming book of stories that we are going to be publishing here in the near future, where your story could appear in print in the book and be available for the public. So we don't have an exact title yet. I think we're going to wait and see what kind of stories we get in from people. We've been posting this on social media, and we've already been getting a lot of great stories coming in. We just want to keep them coming in. So if you have a story that you would like to submit to us, go to our website at the Paranormal at www.paranormalukradionetwork.com. And in the menu, you'll see a link for collecting stories, strange encounters. Click on that and fill out the form. Try to be as detailed as you can, remembering as much as you can from the incident, and hit that submit button, and it'll come to us. We'll let you know when we get it. And, if we need to talk to you further about it, we will. But we want to get a great collection of stories, and we'll try to put together a really good publication that people can enjoy reading for years. So, again, go to our website, paranormalukradionetwork.com, click on the Collecting Stories link to submit your stories to us.
Yeah, and all this was kicked off by the fact that I had that really weird experience a couple of weeks ago going to the airport.
Yes, we talked about it on our last couple of shows. And, even myself, who I rarely, even though I've been investigating the paranormal for 18 years, I rarely have personal experiences. And then there was that one in January where I saw that string of lights moving through the sky that I talked with pilots trying to figure it out. I can't figure out what that was. Not saying it was paranormal, but it was a strange, unexplained experience. So, definitely. So with your stories and this, let's get a lot more stories coming in, and it should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's going to make for a good book. It really will.
I think so.
Yeah, different to what we normally do, but I normally write spy books. So this is going to be completely different.
Right. Well, speaking of stories, that just segues right into our guest for tonight. Our guest tonight, we're speaking with Doctor Scot Kolbara, who is an internist in private practice in Wheaton, Illinois. Dr. Kolbaba has graduated from University of Illinois College of Medicine with honors and did his residency at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago and at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He's been awarded membership in the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Medical Society and has been featured in Chicago Magazine as a top doctor in internal medicine. Well, Scott is not only a doctor, but he just recently published his own book of stories called Physicians' Untold Stories, Miraculous Experiences Doctors Are Hesitant to Share with Their Patients or anyone. So, Scott, we wanted to welcome you to the program.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Irene. It's great to be here.
Scott. Hello. I'm sorry about going on about my non-smoking bit when you were you being a doctor and everything, but I would have still said it no matter who the guest was this week, because I am so proud of myself for getting that far.
That is fantastic, and it's hard to do that. And usually people have some side effects and some jitters and things like that. That you're not having that is incredible. That's wonderful.
No, I'm not having anything. I'm waiting for it still. Oh, dear. Well, I just want one side effect, maybe just one. But no, I'm not getting anything. I'm just abnormal.
Well, you are abnormal. I'll give you that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Well, Scott, let's talk a little bit about your background. I just mentioned about your day job. Your primary life's work is being a physician, and everything that comes with that. But what again made you write this book? Were you having during your practice coming across strange stories?
Mark, I think it was what my wife says is temporary insanity. I have 7 kids, a busy job, and to spend my abundant leisure time between midnight and 1 a.m. writing a book, I think was beyond what I could have expected. And I think there were a couple strange things that happened to me that got me started on this. And I think the tipping point was when Dave Mokel, one of my orthopedic friends, came up to me in a hospital ward. And he grabbed me by the arm and he said, "Scott, I've got this incredible story to tell you about our mutual patient, Mary." And I said, "Okay, Dave, tell me." And he said, "Well, I can't tell you till you hear because someone might hear me." So we rushed off into a empty patient's room. And he told me a story about our mutual patient, Mary, who was having foot surgery. And during the surgery, she arrested. And they found out later that it was the antibiotic that they had given her that caused her to arrest. And in the operating room, when someone arrests, everyone from the operating rooms nearby runs into the room. And one of the guys that was a tech from the room next door started to do CPR on Mary, and she was flatlined. She had no pulse, no respirations, eyes closed, no breathing, no response to pain. She was basically dead. And he started to do CPR, and he had pretty bright red hair underneath his operating room cap, and he was doing CPR, but not adequately enough to get a pulse. So Dr. Mokel, who was in charge of the code, realized that when he was trying to feel her pulse and asked the tech to step aside. Well, he didn't a couple times. And so since the code is not a real polite affair, he just pushed him aside and started to do the CPR himself. And when he did that, she started to generate a pulse. They gave her some epinephrine. She seemed to come back, but she never woke up. But her heart started, and she came back to life. They rushed her off to the CCU where the cardiologist took care of her for a couple of days, and they realized again that it was the antibiotic that caused her to have an anaphylactic reaction and arrest. And she was perfectly fine after 2 or 3 days, and she was ready to go home. She didn't have the surgery, and that had been postponed, obviously, for a while. And Dr. Mokel came into the room to ask her, a few questions and then tell her about some of the post-op or the instructions for taking care of her ankle. And she said, "Thank you for saving my life." And he said, "Well, he's a humble guy." He said that was just a team effort, and we all got together. And she said, No, I saw you push that guy with the red hair aside and start my CPR, and that's when I came back. And by this point, Dr. Mokel got weak knees because he didn't expect that. And she went on to tell him multiple little minutiae of what happened in that operating room that day that no one could have known except if they were right there seeing everything for themselves. So she went on to say that when she arrested, she rose up to the top of the room, and she was able to see everything that happened in the operating room and watch Dr. Mokel and watch the tech and everyone else that was trying to resuscitate her. And she said when she was there, her grandmother came to her, and her grandmother told her that it wasn't her time to go. Her grandmother had been dead for a number of years, and that there was a special place that she would reserve for her in heaven, that when she died, she would go to that place if she was a good person, a good and kind person. Well, Mary was kind of a curmudgeon before this. She's the kind of person that you wouldn't want to have come into your exam room because she'd always have something bad to say about you. Why didn't you fill my prescription? How come you were late? And so forth. After this, Mary was the kindest and nicest person in the world. She'd bring us cookies. She'd help her widowed father a great deal. She didn't live very long. She lived about 3 years. But in that time, she was the nicest person. And I think what ultimately happened to Mary when she died, because she had multiple medical problems, was that she probably did go to that special place that her grandmother had reserved for her. Now, Dr. Mokel was totally blown away because he is a very conservative kind of a doctor. He has a great practice, and he didn't know what to make of this story. And I said, Dave, who did you tell this story to? And he said, no one. I just told my wife because I'd be afraid that people would make fun of me. And so when I heard that story, it got me thinking about other doctors. I wondered if other doctors had similar experiences. I'd had a few little things that happened to me before this, but this was really, doctors don't talk about these kinds of things. They don't talk about spiritual things. They don't talk about religious things, deep-seated feelings of love and so forth. The doctors are talking about golf games and my next gallbladder surgery and things like that.
Yeah.
So it was really a surprise when he came to me with this amazing story, and that he didn't want to tell anyone else. So that got me started to think about interviewing other doctors, and I did. And I hung out in the physician's lounge, which is a great place in the early morning, which has coffee and donuts and other good things, and pounced on doctors as they came in and asked them if they had any unusual stories. And I probably interviewed about 200 doctors, and I've gotten some incredible stories. And the ones that gave me goosebumps or brought me to tears from emotion are the ones I included in this book.
Wow.
And that's pretty much how it got started.
When you were asking them, were they embarrassed or anything? When you first asked them, have you got any ghosty stories or any spooky stories or any unusual stories?
I think they were. And I think they were afraid to tell me because the doctors that I included in this book are these are ordinary docs. These are not there's some there's in every profession there's some docs that are there's some people that are in the mainstream. Then there are people on the edges.
Yeah.
And these are doctors in the mainstream that had nothing to gain from incredible stories, and they had everything to lose, and that is having people think that they were a little bit on the edge and a little bit crazy, and wondering if they should go to these doctors who had dreams and premonitions and visions and things like that. And so it was a little bit of a push to get some of the docs to actually admit to having these stories and to allow me to publish them. And I wondered for the longest time, why would these doctors want me to tell these stories to the world, basically, when they would hardly tell them to their friends?
They're throwing you to the wolves.
Exactly. And I thought we're all going to be chastised, and no one would have a practice after the book came out, and everyone would think we're crazy. But just the opposite has happened. Everyone that has been contributing to the book, and I listed everyone's name in the book, every doctor except for one that had a condition that he had himself and didn't want anyone to know about his condition. But everyone else had their name listed with the story. And I was amazed, and all the doctors were amazed too, that the response has been overwhelming. And it's been, thank you for telling these stories, because I think you guys were talking before the show about how you've had experiences, and I think just about everyone or every family has had an unusual experience that they can't explain. And I think when this book came out, the doctors started telling these stories, people felt better about telling their own stories. And I love to tell these stories in the exam room when I'm seeing patients, and I always get behind. I'm always late, but they will frequently tell me one of their stories back, because they say, well, I've got a story like that too, and I was afraid to tell anyone until this came out. So it was an amazing response. And I think the docs, the real ulterior motive for telling these stories was that again, in the book, I call them sappy do-gooders.
Yeah.
Most docs, I think, really are do-gooders. They want to do good in the world. They want to save someone's life. They want to help someone every day. And I think they realize that by telling these stories, they would give people hope that there's something else out there, that there's a place where people go after they die, that the people that have died ahead of us, our relatives and our good friends, may still be aware of what we're doing in this life. Mm-hmm. So I've had lots of communications from people saying, thank you for writing this book. Thank you for telling these stories, because it gives me hope again. I lost my mother, or I've got a serious illness or whatever. And I think that's what the docs wanted, and I think that's what has happened.
Yeah. Well, you're the second doctor we've actually had on here, About just over a year ago, we had Dr. Ian Rubenstein. Mm-hmm. And he was he had a practice in Enfield, South London, North London, I think it is, North London. Uh-huh. Yeah. And he used to talk to his patients about this sort of stuff. But also, he used to get communication from somewhere when he was treating a patient. You know, he'd. Can you remember when?
Yes,
Dr. Rubenstein was on?
It was a while ago. It was last year, but he was an intuitive, so he could diagnose people based a lot on what information would come to him. So it was a very unique situation.
Yeah, but obviously he still used the medical side of it,
Sure.
you know, the scientific side.
Sure.
But it was, he would be talking to somebody and all of a sudden that person's grandfather would be saying, she's got this, she's upset about this, or this is happening, or whatever. And, you know, he was able to bring that into the treatment.
Very interesting. That's not happened to me. I'm just an ordinary doc, and I've had a few unusual experiences, but nothing like that.
Yeah, he's a very, very, very good doctor. You know.
See, I had an experience with my last doctor. I mean, with him and being able to diagnose. I was coming in and say, "Hey, doctor, my arm hurts when I do this." So he goes, "Don't do that."
Don't do that.
I knew something was coming.
Well, Scott, let me ask you. Before this happened, or before you started collecting these stories, what was your belief system? I mean, were you religious? Did you have a certain belief system about an afterlife, or maybe an agnostic? I mean, how did you come into this before you started getting these stories?
I've always been a Christian. I believe that there's something else. I believe there's a heaven. I believe there's a God, and I believe there's an afterlife. And so I'm a pretty boring, traditional kind of a Christian. And so I went into this with that belief system. And then hearing these stories certainly strengthened a number of those beliefs. I've had a couple experiences. One of those was on vacation. And I was in Cape Cod. You probably know, Mark, where Cape Cod is, being from
yes.
New Jersey. So we go to Cape Cod about every 2 or 3 years, and I like to bring my whole family. I love vacations. I've loved vacations when I was a kid. My parents used to take me to Yellowstone and places like that, and in Montana, and we'd love to go together and have a wonderful time on vacation. So I've kept that tradition, and I like to bring my whole family. And the amazing thing, Mark and Irene, is that when the dad pays for the vacation, it's amazing how many kids come along. And so we were in Cape Cod.
I know that one.
And I just love to have the whole family, so I don't mind doing that. And we were all in Cape Cod. And have you ever had one of those days where you just have to pinch yourself? It's such a perfect day that you'll never forget the day the rest of your life.
Very few of those.
Yeah, very few. But you remember those days, and this was one of those days. It was a beautiful day. We had spent the day on the beach. We'd come home, and on our vacations, the boys cook. So we were cooking a special dinner, swordfish on the grill and corn on the cob and baked potatoes and things like that. And when we were at the store, the boys saw this whole stack of pies. And they were cherry pies, and we bought 5 of them because that's how many people we had on vacation with us. We needed 5 pies for one meal. And so we finished the dinner, which was we did a good job, and it was a great dinner, and everyone was having a wonderful time. And I kept thinking about my mother, who had passed away, and how much she would have enjoyed this family time. She was a real family person. And I kept thinking, it's too bad she couldn't be here to live to see this and live with the whole family and communicate with us and so forth. And so the boys were talking about what kind of pies they liked, and they happened to mention my mom's pie because she used to make a rhubarb pie that was outstanding. We had a rhubarb plant in our backyard, and every fall she would go out and pick all the stalks of the rhubarb. And she'd make about 3 or 4 pies, and we would, when we go visit her, we'd sneak into the kitchen, and the germ theory aside, we'd go right into the pies with spoons, and everyone would eat as much as they could, as fast as they could, and we loved that. And I'm sure my mother knew we were sneaking into the kitchen to do that, and she loved that too.
Well, that's
so
memories, isn't it?
It was a great memory. Yeah. And when we were in Cape Cod, we at this particular dinner, I thought to myself, I know if my mom was here, she'd make us a rhubarb pie instead of having this cherry pie. So we finished the dinner, and my wife served the pie and the cherry pie, and I took a bite, and all of a sudden I got goosebumps and chills because it wasn't a cherry pie; it was rhubarb. I looked at the box. The box said cherry pie, but there was no question that pie that I had was rhubarb.
It was rhubarb inside.
It was rhubarb inside. It was not
Wow.
cherry. And I thought to myself, I just wonder if this is a way of my mom communicating with us and telling us that she was really there on this special, special day, that she knew what was going on, and she was aware of our special family occasion. So that was one of the first experiences that was kind of off the ordinary, that got me thinking about some of these things. And then I had some of the experiences with the docs that made me want to go further. And one of the things that actually pushed me forward was a meeting with a publisher. Now, doctors, it seems, have patients that do every kind of profession you can imagine. And I happen to have a publisher that's in my practice, and I collected a few of these stories, and I called him up. And it's interesting that I didn't realize he was a publisher until I was, and this is another interesting coincidence, I was looking online. You guys know who Ben Carson is, the neurosurgeon from Johns Hopkins that now is Health and Human Services
Yes.
Secretary?
Yes.
I was looking for him because he has some great stories like these, and I was hoping to be able to get him to contribute to the book. And as I was looking online, there was a picture that popped up, and it was one of my patients. And I thought, that's crazy. Why would my patient, Scott McDonald, pop up on Ben Carson's website? Well, he was the publisher that published Ben Carson's books. So as soon as I realized that, I called him up. What a coincidence this is. And I said, Scott, I've got some stories that I'd like you to listen to. Since you're a publisher, I'd like you to tell me if these stories have any merit, if you think a book would come out of these stories. So he said, sure. And we had a lunch. And then during the lunch, I was really hungry, so I wasn't paying much attention to him as I was eating and telling stories and eating and telling stories. And all of a sudden, I noticed that he stopped eating, and he was very quiet. And so I looked up at him for the first time for a few minutes, and he had tears in his eyes. And I thought to myself, if these stories have that much emotional impact that causes this publisher who listens to hundreds and hundreds of stories every year, there must be something to this. And he said to me, you have to publish this book. These stories are just too meaningful that they have to be published. So that's really that was the final tipping point, and that's when I started to go ahead and really become serious.
Oh, that's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
I think we've all growing up in our lives, we've all had little experiences like your incident with the pie. And, too many times I feel that we easily explain it away, or yes. When we talk to somebody, like, I remember growing up in my house, I would hear my name being called. And it's kind of sounded like my mother. I'm not sure, but I'd go to my mother in another part of the house. I go, what do you want? She goes, I didn't call you. And I go, yeah, well, I heard you call me. She goes, it's your imagination. You get told that enough times, and when it does happen, you blow it off like, it's my imagination. I think we program kids. Kids are very sensitive to seeing yes. a lot of things. And too many times, I think society and our culture programs it right out of them to stop seeing these things, or to at least not acknowledge them.
Yeah, that's what I found too, and that's one of the purposes of the book, is to have people be aware of those little coincidences that happen in their lives that they may have written off before. And even I, after I published the book, realized there were some things in my past that I had ignored and written off as coincidental, but were really something more than that. I'm convinced now. Getting into medical school, I was kind of not a great student in college. I didn't have a direction. I was an economics major and had given up my idea about going to medical school. So my grades weren't that outstanding. And when I finished, after I finished and went back to the workaday world, I realized I really did want to go back to medical school and finish and get my MD degree. So I had to do some prerequisites, some courses that I didn't take in college, and one of those was organic chemistry, which is a killer course. That's the separator, I think, between those that are serious and those that aren't serious. And I was working at the time. I had a family, so I'd given myself one more year, because I'd been trying to get into medical school for a couple of years and didn't succeed. And so I said, I've got one more year to do this, and if I'll get into I'll get into my organic chemistry class. So there was a night school. 2 classes were available in the Chicagoland area, one at Roosevelt University, which is downtown Chicago, and one at Aurora University, which is near where I was living, and I was working in Aurora. So I thought, this is great. So I enrolled in organic chemistry, and I went to the bookstore to get the books, and there were maybe 30 or 40 books that were just falling off the shelves. There were so many. I thought, this is great. This is going to be a big class. I'll be able to take this class and go home right from where I am and not have a long drive or anything like that. Well, I got to the first class, and there were 3 students in the class. The professor walked in and said, "I'm very sorry. We're going to have to cancel this class because there's lack of students." And I thought, oh no, my medical school career is over. I'm not going to be a doctor. I'll be a failure in life and so forth. And then I realized there was another class offered at Roosevelt University, which is 70 miles away downtown Chicago. But it was for me at that time, it was worth it to do that. So the next day, I made some lame excuse that I'm going to go downtown to talk with my boss and go downtown. I went to the Roosevelt University registrar and got in line. When I finally got to the front of the line, I said, I want to enroll in an organic chemistry class at nighttime. And she said, I'm very sorry, the class is filled. As a matter of fact, we have one class that's filled. We opened up a second class, which is now filled, and we have 10 people on the waiting list for the next class, which we're not going to open. We don't have the teachers. And I thought, oh no, my life is over. And I said to her, you don't understand, if I don't get into organic chemistry, I'll be a failure in life. And she said, 10 other people that are on the waiting list have exactly the same story as you. So I finally said, who can make the final decision about letting people into the organic chemistry class? And she said, just the professor. He's the only one that can let anyone in when the class is filled. So I said, where does the professor live? And she said, upstairs, 3rd floor. And so I ran upstairs, and there was a room full of kids. And I think each of those kids probably had the same intention that I did. And I must have looked just terrible to the secretary. I think I might have had a tear in my eye or something. And I said, can I just talk with the professor for like 2 minutes? And she said, if you can just talk for 2 minutes, I'll let you go ahead of everyone else. And so I got a bunch of dirty looks as I walked up to the anteroom, right where the professors were meeting. There were 2 professors that were discussing things in their office at the time, the 2 professors teaching the class. And the door was paper thin, and I could hear through the door, and I could hear them talking about the class, and they said, we don't have enough books. We don't know where we're going to get the books because the publisher is out of books. Any university in the area has no more organic chemistry books, and in those days, this is before computers, we had to rely on books. So they had enough books for the first class, but none for the next class, which was starting the next day, and they were in a real panic. So they talked a little bit more, and then the one professor left, and the other one signaled for me to come in and talk with him. And he looked very bored. And I said, I told him my story about how I needed to get in, and if I didn't, I would be a failure in life. And he said, I'm very sorry, we have 10 people on the waiting list. I just can't. He shook my hand and saw me out. And then I got the feeling that this was a desperate situation, which called for desperate times. So I said to him, if I can get the books, will you let me in the class? And all of a sudden, he seemed to wake up. He opened his eyes. He looked. His eyebrows went up. By this point, Mark and Irene, my heart was in my throat. I could feel my pulse in my neck, thinking that my life is on the line here. And he waited for a long time, and it seemed like forever before he answered me. And then he said, can you get me 30? And I said, more. And then he said the wonderful words, you're in. I told him where the books were. I got into the class. I was enrolled. And I was thinking to myself, what a neat coincidence all my life until I wrote this book. And I realized, what's the likelihood that I would be there at that very time when the 2 professors were talking about what they needed, and only I could help them, and only they could help me. And we met right at that very second. The likelihood of that being just a pure coincidence was negligible. And I think there was someone upstairs
orchestrating it.
Yeah. And it was more than a coincidence. And I put that stories in my book, and I think that illustrates what I'd like to have people realize, that there are things that happen to all of us, sometimes every day, that are little coincidences that we don't realize until we actually think about them. This was a pretty big coincidence, and this changed my life. But there are little things that happen to us all the time. So I'd like people to realize that to look for coincidences in their lives, because they're there. And you guys have probably had those kinds of things happen to you at some point too.
Well, that's sorry, Mark. That's what triggered us to write this book that we're in the throes of doing now. Is the fact that something very similar happened to me going to my cousin's funeral in Scotland. I would have missed the aeroplane if it hadn't been for my mystery visitor in the car.
Interesting.
Sure.
Interesting.
Well, we've already told the story on air a couple times, but just for you, with the short version, she and her husband were trying to get to the airport in Bristol to fly up to Scotland, and they got lost. And suddenly, this man appeared on the side of the road, kind of out of nowhere, an elderly man, and they asked him for directions. And he goes, "I'll have to show you." And he climbed in the car with them, and showed
4
him
o'clock in the morning. This was
showed him how to get to the airport. And he seemed strange. He wasn't answering a lot of questions. And then when they got to the airport about 20 minutes later, he said, "Just drop me off here." And he walked out of the car, and all of a sudden he was gone.
Isn't that something?
And then later, she and her husband compared notes, and they both realized that they saw him completely different hair. One saw glasses, one didn't, different colored jackets. I mean, it was just really an unusual experience.
Those things happen, I think, possibly more than we realize. And I'd love to have people be aware of those kinds of. That was a pretty spectacular miracle that happened to you guys, but there are little things that happen to us all the time, little coincidences on the elevator. You happen to bump into someone that tells you about a job situation that you were looking for, or you look on the internet like I did, looking for a person to help write some stories for you, and all of a sudden I discover a publisher that helped me throughout the whole course of writing the book, and things like that. I was looking for a doc, for example, to tell me one of his stories, and he had retired, he'd moved away, and I was really sorry that I wasn't able to connect with him. And I went to a funeral of another fellow doctor, and while I was in line, who happens to come through the door but the very person that I needed to talk to right then, and I was able to get his story. And so there are things like that happen to us all the time, I'm convinced. See, we just need to look at them.
I look at those as, I don't call them coincidences, I call them synchronicities.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And in those types of synchronicities, you could see like something behind the scenes manipulating. I lost my identical twin brother a year and a half ago of a cardiac arrest. Thank you. And one of the things that I noticed within the 3 months after he had passed, during that time, I kept everywhere I turned on, if I turned on the radio or if I had my iPod and I turned it on, almost every single time the Pink Floyd song "Wish You Were Here" would come on.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
And that song had a lot of meaning because that's how I felt about my brother. I wish he was here. And yet I was hearing it everywhere for a very short period of time. Now, it's one of my favorite songs ever. And since that time, I don't hear it nearly as much, even though it's still one of my favorite songs. But for that time period, that about 3 months during the time after he'd passed, I was hearing it everywhere. And so that's something that possibly you could chalk up as a synchronicity, where maybe he was letting me know he was around.
Well, I think a lot of the doctors recognize that there's some way that when people have died, there may be some way of them communicating with us. And Steve Graham, one of the ER docs, tells an interesting story about seeing a guy in the emergency room with some abdominal pain that wasn't very serious. And he noticed a tattoo on his arm. The tattoo was a dime. And he thought that was really strange. And he was afraid to ask him because he didn't want to be prying. But the curiosity got the best of him. And he said, I noticed this dime on your arm. Can you tell me the story of that? Is there some meaning to that? And the fellow said, well, there is. My son collects coins. And his favorite coin is a dime. And it seems that whenever we would go to a special place, like this is Chicago, so they'd go to a Cubs game or something like that, and they'd pull the seat up, and there'd be a dime on the floor. And when he'd go to a special restaurant, he'd pick up the plate, there'd be a dime under the plate. And so he said, my son was tragically killed in an automobile accident on the expressway. And ever since he's been killed, whenever I go to a special place like that he would love, I find a dime. And I started collecting those dimes, and I put them in a pouch, and I've got a large pouch of dimes. And he said, I think my son is looking out for me and lets me know that he still is around, even though he's gone. That's a great comfort to me. And Dr. Graham thought that was a kind of a neat story. He didn't make fun of the guy at all because, you don't want to do that. But he really didn't believe the story. And he took care of the abdominal pain, gave him some medication, and then he went back. Dr. Graham went back to the dictation area or the doctor's area. And he pulled out the chair, and then he saw something spread on the floor. He looked down. It was a dime. And he said to himself, thank you. Robbie was the name of the boy. He said, thank you, Robbie, for helping me believe. And so I think there are strange circumstances that give us a hint that people that have gone ahead of us may still be able to communicate with us in strange and sometimes wonderful ways. And I think Steve Graham now is a believer that dime was really more than just a coincidence.
I had an experience last year where I was in. I've been very healthy all my life. Rarely am I ever in the hospital. I think before last year, the only other times I was in the hospital was to get my being born and getting my tonsils out, or like getting a gash on my head and needing some stitches. But but last year I was getting just a simple procedure. You know that one us men have to get when we get older. They have to go do some exploring.
I do that myself.
Yeah, doing the old spelunking. Anyway, when I was in there, I was waiting for them to bring me up to the room. So I'm laying on a gurney. They got an IV in me already, and I'm just sitting there. And this is a very strange experience. It wasn't visual. It wasn't auditory. It was, all I can tell you, it was a knowing. I felt that all of a sudden 4 people came into the room. Couldn't see anybody. Nothing. I knew there was my father, my brother, my grandmother, and an aunt who had passed a couple years ago. And I have never before ever had anything like that happen to me. Ever. Sensing. And I could tell that they came in, even though it was just coming in for a simple procedure. For me, it was the first time kind of being in a hospital, going under anesthesia like that. So I was feeling a little emotional about it, but then I just came in and felt like they were reassuring me. And I was kind of having a conversation with them in my head. And it was it lasted a few minutes, and then it was gone. But a very unique experience that I can't sit here and tell anybody, this really happened, because it all seemed to play out in my head, but it felt real.
There are strange things like that have happened to many of the doctors too. There's a great story from Dr. Heitzler, who is one of the gynecologists that I work with, and he actually has delivered 2 of our kids. So we use him quite a bit, and our kids that he delivered are still talking and upright, and so I guess he did a good job with them. But he tells a story about his wife who is delivering their 5th child. I think he has 8 children. And the 5th child, the delivery went really well, but her grandmother, Joan, who is his wife, grandmother is Grandma Hanlon. And with 2 gynecologists in the room, Dr. Heister and his partner, the partner was doing the delivery. Grandma Hanlon steps in, who was a midwife, and literally saved Joan's life. And the story is interesting because Grandma Hanlon was a midwife that came from Ireland, and she was working in Chicago delivering babies, and she'd be the midwife for the family. And they would, in those days, the midwife would stay with the family for a number of weeks to help out and things like that. And she was kind of the spiritual leader of the family. If her family couldn't afford to pay her, she'd do it for nothing. And she would do things like when she was taking the train down to Chicago, and there were some street people, she would give them food or money, and people would laugh at her, and they'd say, why are you giving these people on the street money when they'll just use it for alcohol? And she would say, my job is to help them out, and that's what God would want me to do. And if they would decide to buy alcohol with it, that's their thing. But my job is to do as much as I can to help them out. So she was quite the spiritual individual, quite religious. And when she got old and she couldn't deliver babies anymore, she went to live with Joan and Joan's mother. And Joan was a little girl at the time. And Joan would say, if I can make it to Grandma O'Hanlon's lap, if I'm in trouble with my mom, I know I'd be safe. And they formed a bond of love that was just beyond what you could imagine. They were just really, really close. And when Joan was delivering the baby, the baby was delivered, and afterwards she started to have some pain. But she didn't take any pain medication before that, but she decided then she needed some pain medication for the procedures they were doing after the birth. And so in those days, they would give Trilene, which is an anesthetic that would be administered by mask, and they would put a woman into a deep sleep, and then she'd be able to have any procedure done because she'd be in a deep sleep. Well, they were about ready to put the mask onto Joan when Grandma O'Hanlon steps in the room in a typical dress with the polka dots and a little white sweater vest and her white hair up in a bun and old lady shoes. And she stood at the foot of the bed and she shook her head for Joan not to put the Trilene on. Well, Joan didn't understand why, but she pushed it away because she listened to her grandmother. And about a minute later, no one had realized, by the way, that Joan had eaten a large meal before she went into labor. And about a minute later, after she pushed the mask away, which would have put her into a deep sleep, she vomited the entire meal. Can you imagine what would have happened had she had the mask on and had been under a deep anesthetic? She would have aspirated.
Yep. And
she could have died from that. And Joan said afterwards that she made it to Grandma O'Hanlon's lap one last time, transcending time and all eternity, because Grandma O'Hanlon had died 22 years before that.
Wow. That's just blown me away.
So
really
talk about things that happen from those that have gone before and have come back to help us. So I think a lot of the doctors have recognized that there are things that those that have passed before us are aware of what's going on with us. And I think my mother was an example of that too. So this was quite a story that Dr. Heisler and his wife told me about good old Grandma O'Hanlon. So, but coming back from the other side and helping out and with the situations in this world. So
now we call it the other side, and yet we still don't really know for sure where it is. I know a lot of people, depending on their background, and we could discuss this further if you have cases like this in your book, people will tend to have experiences that mirror or at least are generated from their own belief system and background. I've talked with numerous people who've had near-death experiences. Some will say, if they come from a Christian background, they'll say they've seen Jesus, or Saint Michael seems to be a big one, or Saint Germain. If you're Catholic, you start getting a lot of the saints rather than just Jesus or God. And and a lot of times, it's not like that happens to, let's say, Muslims or somebody or Hindus. They would see things in accordance with their own beliefs. And I firmly believe that whatever is on the other side, and if people come to you in the form of a familiar figure from your religion or your belief system, they're doing it to make you more comfortable. But
I suspect that's the case. I suspect that these kinds of things are to help us and not to make us afraid or to make us fearful. So I've had a number of stories that doctors have told like that, where they have some warm experience. Dr. Saran, John Saran, for example, is a general internist like I am. And he tells a story about a patient of his and also a neighbor that was dying of colon cancer. And he was at home. He was in hospice and at home. And just before he was ready to leave the earth, he was talking with his wife. And he said, "Did you see those girls there?" And she said, "What girls?" And he said he saw 3 young girls dressed in white dancing in a circle. And his wife, who is very attuned to picking up on these kinds of signals went right along with them. And she said, those are probably angels that have come to take you back. And so he said to her, I'll take care of the things. When I go, I'll take care of the things on the other side if you take care of things on the earth, because they were still worried about their family and their kids and so forth. And she said, I'd be glad to do that. And he closed his eyes, and then he died. And so Dr. Saran thinks that those were the angels, and so does the wife, that were coming to take him back. And that was very comforting to him to see those happy angels, and even though his wife didn't see them, that you talked about as being a familiar thing that's comforting. So I think that kind of thing happens, and it probably does happen in different religions in different ways.
Yeah, I believe that the other side, in a lot of ways, this is just my own personal belief, and Irene and I have had many discussions about this over the years, is that I think what's really on the other side and what we deal with is really beyond our comprehension as human beings and the way our brains work now. And I think that, let's face it, it's silly when religions say we're the only true religion. If you don't believe in us, you're going to hell or you're a heretic or whatever. When true spirituality is that we all transcend and go somewhere beyond this physical plane. And I believe we interact with some entities from these planes, and they'll shapeshift, they'll change in order to make us feel comfortable in the beginning until we can make that transition to a more full form and maybe get our memories and understand, hey, this is the way it really is, because in the human form we can't understand it. So
I think it's a lot of this is beyond our total understanding. I would agree that I don't think we understand totally what's out there, but many of the doctors, interestingly, were some were religious, some were totally not religious at all, and they still had these incredible experiences that made them really think about what is out there. And so the experiences that they had were not related to being religious or not religious, because I've got the whole gamut of doctors in the book that some are very religious and some are not atheists, but have no religion and don't go to church. So it was interesting.
Well, it's in popular culture, and I'm sure in your experiences you've probably seen this, where people who are near death start connecting with the other side. They're able to see and hear things, or at least they act this way just before they pass. That it seems like there's somebody in the room and everybody else can't see them, but they can. And it's been shown in popular culture, in movies and TV. And so there's an awareness in the general public about that. People are dying, maybe see somebody. Well, this is a funny little story. My mother-in-law, when her mother was passing, and she was sitting with her towards the end, and she kept looking up at the ceiling, smiling, and raising her arm like she was reaching up for somebody and grabbing it. Well, my mother-in-law, knowing what that meant, and wasn't ready for her mother to go, would grab her arm and shove it down and go, "Ma, you ain't going nowhere." It's like, that's stop funny. It. And every time she raised her arm, she'd grab it, go, "Ma," and shove it down to keep her from, because she didn't want her to go yet.
Yeah. The doctors have some of the doctors have had stories like that too, where a good friend would be dying and they'd be in the room, and they would be in a deep coma, pretty much ready to go. And all of a sudden they would sit up, open their eyes, reach out like they're reaching towards someone, and then lie back, and that was it. So I think there are strange things that happen when we are about ready to leave the earth, that and maybe someone comes to get us. There was an interesting story from one of the ER docs, and the ER seems to be a place where lots of these kinds of things happen, because when people come to the ER, the emergency room, they are frequently very close to death. And Fred Bullhofer, who's one of the ER docs in our local hospital, was telling a story about a guy that had came in with a heart attack. The ambulance pulled up, and he arrested in the ambulance. And then he got resuscitated. They shocked him, and they brought him into the cardiac unit in the ER. And on the way there, he arrested again, had to be shocked again, and then I think arrested one more time, and they had to shock him. Finally got him on some medication, which stabilized his heart, and he was okay. And when he woke up, he looked very comfortable and very at peace. And Dr. Bollhofer said to him, how come you can be so calm? Didn't you know what happened to you? And he said, yeah, I was just shocked a couple of times, and I knew I arrested. And he said, but the funny thing is, when I arrested the first time, I saw my wife, and she walked up to me and was very calm, and it helped me be calm. And then the next time, she was joined by my father and my brother. And Dr. Bollhofer said, well, are they going to come and visit you when you're in the hospital here? And he said, they've all been dead for a number of years. And so his interpretation, at least the person that had arrested, was that he was ready to go, and they had come down to take him back. And that since he survived, they disappeared. So I think there's a lot of literature about that in the medical field, about those that have passed away that may show up again toward the end of life. And I think when you talk with palliative care docs and nurses, they'll all have a story about someone reaching out or reaching their hand up, just like you were saying, Mark, to grab the hand of someone that's coming down to carry them away. So interesting concept, and I think there's maybe something to that.
Now, Scott, I'd like your opinion, because talking to a physician such as yourself, I have rudimentary understanding of, anatomy and knowing that when physical death comes and the brain being without oxygen for more than 4 minutes is usually irreparable brain damage and death. And yet there are stories that of people who have been clinically dead for many minutes. Sometimes, I think once I read one about 20 minutes clinically dead, and that they were able to revive them and they came back with no brain damage. And a strange case. And then, of course, also talk about having these near-death experiences on top of that. But just to confirm, when there is brain death, there is no electrical activity in the brain. Synapses are not firing. They should not. Right. I mean, there was a report I remember coming out a couple of years ago where they tried to dismiss the whole near-death experiences as neurons firing and death causing hallucinations, and but then there are those stories where there was no brain activity. There was flatline, brain dead, and they still had those experiences. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's those kinds of experiences probably bridge a whole gamut of experiences. I think that many people are right that when the brain does die, there are some things that happen that can cause hallucinations or experiences that are explainable by lack of blood supply to the brain. I think that happens. I think when people die, they're assumed to be dead, but maybe the heartbeat is slow, but still is present. So I think there are those kinds of things that have happened. But in writing a book like I've written, I think there are other experiences that you just simply can't explain. And you have to say, this is a miraculous thing that this person shouldn't have come back, and they did. So I think they all get mixed in together. But I think if you have some very reliable sources and can document things pretty carefully, there are some mysterious things that happen when we think people are brain dead, that they really do come back. We had a circumstance here. Two doctors were really good friends, Dr. John Messett, who's a gynecologist, and Bob Cornell, who's a family practice doc. And they used to meet in the physician's lounge in the morning, and they'd talk about their favorite subject, which is their family and fishing. And Cornell was quite a fisherman, and he would tell you whatever lure you could use in any body of water in the whole country and some foreign countries. He was just that kind of a gung-ho fisherman. He would know everything you can think of about fishing. And so one day, Messett went into the doctor's lounge, and Cornell wasn't there, and he found out that he was in the ICU. He had a massive stroke the night before, and he was basically brain dead. And so they talked with the intensivist who was in charge of the ICU, and he said, I'm real sorry that for your friend Bob Cornell. We're just going to keep him around for the ventilator just so that we can make absolutely certain he's not going to come back. And if he's not doesn't come back in the next 3 days, we're going to pull the plug, and that'll be it. And Messett realized what kind of a friend he was. He didn't know how close he was to Bob Cornell until Bob Cornell wasn't there anymore. And you know how frustrated you get when you have a person that's in a terrible situation. You don't know what to do. You can't do anything. So he decided to do something that was a little strange. He moved his chair up close to Bob Cornell's face, pulled the curtain on the cubby hole where they were located. And he started to tell him stories, a fishing story. He told him a fishing story about fishing in Canada, near the Great Slave Lake. There's a river there, the Mackenzie River, I think it's called, where they caught grayling. And he told about how he caught so many grayling, he hurt his arms reeling them all in. He caught perhaps 100. It was a catch and release kind of a thing, 100 a day. He'd never told this story to Bob Cornell before. And every day he would tell him a story like that he was there. And his John Messett's wife said to him, "You're a crazy guy. What are you telling this person who's brain dead stories about fishing for? He's not going to remember it. He's not alive. They're going to pull the plug tomorrow." Well, the day that he was going to die, John Messett walked into the ICU, and the bed was already taken down. The light was off. The room was dark, and he realized that he had gone. And so he went to the nurse, and he said, when did Dr. Cornell leave? When did he die? And the nurse laughed at him. And Ethan was pretty offended about that. And she said, he didn't die. He woke up yesterday. He's now in the step-down unit, and he's doing great. So it took a couple of days for the two to catch up with each other, and they finally caught up maybe a week later, when Cornell had been into some rehab and had actually come back to visit into the doctor's lounge. And he said to Dr. Messett, I want to thank you. And Dr. Messett said, what for? And he said, for telling me those fishing stories. And he went on to relate the exact same thing that Dr. Messett had told him about the graylings and catching 100 the first day and reeling them in and hurting his arms and so forth. And he said, you mean you really heard me? And he said, yeah, you were the only one that talked with me. I could hear everything going on, but I look forward to having you tell me those stories every single day. And he was so close to death that Dr. Messett wondered if, when we get that far along, if we can make a conscious decision to cross that river, to cross that bridge, to cross into the special garden where we're going, whether we can come back or determine whether or not we leave the earth. And he was thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, that those stories were so interesting to Dr. Cornell and his true passion in life that he came back from a near-death situation just because of some of those stories. He'll never know for sure. Dr. Cornell went on to live a good long life, and he ultimately died of some other cardiac-related problems many, many years later. And it's unfortunate that he never made it to the Mackenzie River, at least not in this life. So you wonder if people are truly brain dead, how much, if they really are brain dead, and how much they really can hear when they're in that state. So I think, Mark, in answer to your question, there are lots of things that happen when people are, quote, brain dead that may not be strict science and hard science. So
definitely not hard science, because let's face it, our science only considers something that it can measure and quantify in a laboratory setting. And right. When we're dealing with things of the spirit or paranormal or whatever you want to, it's not like we could drag that into a lab and put it under a microscope and measure it.
For sure. For sure.
I think a lot of the properties of what we're dealing with are, again, beyond our comprehension, beyond our science. We're not there yet. That would be like 200 years ago trying to explain radiation to somebody.
Right.
We're not there yet, even though we like to think we are. But, there's one of the things that we've looked at a lot with Irene and I in our discussions and research is the fact that if you're dealing with if we do have a spirit, that these bodies, these meat suits we're wearing, has a spirit, and when we die, that spirit is released and goes somewhere else. Then there's a possibility that if maybe somebody may be in a coma or maybe even almost brain dead, and then if they were able to come back, that spirit might be what is hearing it, or even the mind, that this higher self, as we like to talk about sometimes, is aware of that conversation and holds on to it, even though the body may not physically have been able to. The
Right.
spirit and the mind might. That's just like the people who that you were explaining earlier. They have the near-death experience and they see everything that's going on in the operating room. And they know what they're not only what they're talking about, what color people are wearing, what color hats, or if somebody's passing a certain tool. They remember these things that the body would never have been able to remember. So, yeah, I think when you're dealing with people who are in those types of states, it's a wonderful thing to talk to them and continue to try to communicate with them, because I think that they can hear you. Even if it's on a subconscious level, they may wake up and not remember it, but I think on a subconscious level, it's still in there.
And I think that's what Dr. Messett wanted people to realize, that, when you have someone that you love greatly and they're presumably in a coma or dead or something, if you talk with them, that may make a difference. And they may actually hear you, either spiritually or physically. It's unclear how that works, but there are things that can be influenced by conversation from a loved one that you don't realize.
Yeah, but you're talking about that back in, I think it was 1979 or something, late 70s anyway. My mother had a brain tumor, undiagnosed brain tumor, and she was rushed into a hospital. And she went into a coma. And I sat there all day talking to her and calling her a dingbat. I kept saying to her, come on, Mum, don't be a dingbat. You can hear me. I was talking about this, that, and anything. But I kept using the word dingbat. Anyway, she was transferred by ambulance to Ackerson Morley, which was one of the best hospitals of the time. Unfortunately closed down now. And she had an operation where they took the tumour off the back of her head. And when she did come round and she was able to speak again, and I walked into the ward, she turned around and said, "Don't call me a dingbat." She was in the phone when I was doing that. So she just said, "Don't call me a dingbat." And I thought, you heard me, you old bugger.
You wonder if that kept her going, if your voice and those kind of jokes that you were telling her kept her going. I think in many cases it does. I think the loved one and love is a very powerful influence in the world. And I think those kinds of conversations may keep a person alive when they otherwise would have stepped over that bridge or gone to the other side.
Yeah. So. I had a couple of experiences. Many years ago, I had a miscarriage, and I was taken into hospital to have the scrape. And I was knocked out and put out and everything. And when I came round and they were wheeling me, I remember they were wheeling me out of the lift. And just as we got outside, I started shouting that I wanted to go back. What I'd actually seen while I was out unconscious, I was in a room with my father, who died back in the 70s, and my auntie Lizzie. Now, she used to be a nurse, and in that room, she was wearing her uniform. And the three of us were sitting on chairs in a triangle talking.
Interesting.
And I remember that as clear as a bell.
Well, there are some doctors that have reported stories about people that were in a coma and seemed to go to the other side and then came back. There was a story about a fellow by the name of Cleveland who had a surgery on his wrist to create a fistula, which is a connection between an artery and a vein for dialysis. And evidently at home, one of those sutures came out. And when you have an artery that's bleeding, it's spurting blood out pretty quickly. And it wasn't very long before Cleveland was in a coma, and blood was all over the living room. They called the ambulance, and they brought him right into the hospital, where he looked like a ghost, evidently, according to Robin Mraz, who was the ER doc at the time. And can you imagine, here's a guy with his arm still bleeding, paramedics holding his arm as tightly as they could, somebody doing CPR straddled over your chest, and him being wheeled into the ER looking like a ghost. Well, Dr. Mraz had seen this before, and had actually saved a person's life by giving him enough blood and staying with them. So even though his blood count was near zero, and his vitals were zero also, no blood pressure, no pulse, nothing, they gave him a number of units of blood. They just poured it in right away, squeezed the bags in, and after a couple hours, he actually was conscious. And when he woke up finally in the ER a number of hours later, he said to Dr. Mraz, I'd like you to move me back to that room where you're playing the music. And Dr. Mraz said to him, we don't play music in the emergency room. And he went on to describe a room that he was at where they were playing beautiful music that he'd never heard before. And it was all white, and he was sitting there very, very happy and very peaceful. And Dr. Mraz and Robin, who was the nurse taking care of him at the time, looked at each other, and they thought, he's been somewhere other than where he is right now. He was actually mad that he couldn't go back to that room. He liked it so much, and he was mad at his wife.
Yeah, that's not me. I was so angry. I just wanted to go back and be with my dad and my Auntie Lizzie in that room, and that was a white room. But there was these, and the only thing in it was us sitting on these three chairs, Dad at the head, and then me and Auntie Lizzie, like in a triangle. Yeah,
I
wonder about that. You wonder if that's really something that actually did happen and not just a dream.
Oh, so real.
I know.
And it must have happened. And also on that particular, I was put on a ward, and there was this old lady on the ward, and it was about 3:00 in the morning, and I couldn't sleep, and I sat up in bed, and I looked over at the old lady, and she's sitting there talking away to a little old man that was sitting on the in our hospitals, we have NHS armchairs beside the beds.
Yeah.
And this little old man was sitting in this NHS armchair beside the bed, and they were chatting away. And she was telling him, don't do this, do that, make sure you... And she was having a go at him, and then she was laughing, and she was having a jolly old time with her nighttime visitor, this little old man. And I sat there and watched, and I knew then that he wasn't real, that he was dead. But I sat and watched him for a little while, and then I lay back down and I tried to go back to sleep. And the following morning, the team came in to assess her, and they were asking all sorts of questions. What day is it?
Sure.
Who's the Queen? Who's the Prime Minister? She had Alzheimer's, I think.
Yeah.
But she certainly didn't have that when she was chatting to the old boy.
Interesting things happen that you can't explain in this life. And I think that's what the doctors realize, that there are some things that you just simply can't explain scientifically that we should look out for. And I think we all have these experiences. You both have had these unusual experiences, and I think many people have. And my goal in writing the book was to have people realize that these experiences exist. They should look for them, and look for the little experiences that aren't the striking things that, like you mentioned, that are little coincidences and little synchronicities, as you said, Mark, that happen to all of us at some point, and sometimes on a regular basis. It's very interesting.
Well, let me take a little sidetrack here and ask if of the stories that you have heard of and compiled, I know we're dealing with a lot of positive stories of love and light, people meeting relatives and going to, a better place. But have you encountered, or have any of your colleagues encountered, stories that may not be so positive, that may indicate, somebody who had kind of a bad experience?
You know, I listened to about 200 doctors tell me stories, and I included about 30 of the stories that I thought were the most significant and the most moving. I didn't hear any negative stories at all, and I was a little surprised about that. And that's really the case. You think about, well, maybe someone saw flames and had a dream about some bad things. No one told me a story like that at all. So, and when you talk with the palliative care, there's a couple palliative care doctors that have some gray hair and they've been around for a while, and I asked them when they have encountered people that are dying, actively dying, and they know that they're dying, have you had any? Have they had any experiences that you've witnessed that were frightening or terrible or unpleasant? And universally, they say no. That the people that they have dealt with that are dying have not had any of these horrible, awful experiences. And I'm sure that they exist. I'm sure that that happens, and there are books about that. But the docs that I talk with and the palliative care doctors universally told me stories that were positive, hopeful, uplifting. And I think when you think about if you believe that there's something else out there, which I do, and the docs did too, I think they want us to be happy and content, and they don't want to frighten us. And I think that's what these stories are about. These are stories about love and guidance from a power that's higher than us. And so, no, the long answer to your quick question was no. We really haven't had any negative or scary experiences that were related to me, at least.
In the past, I have talked to a couple of people who they think they've had some negative experiences. Although there's this one gentleman, Grady Mosley, and he passed away a couple of years ago. But he when we had him on the show, but when he was describing it, basically what happened is he OD'd on drugs and was tripping and had a bad trip. But he was trying to call it a near-death experience, and I had to disagree with him there. I go, no, I think you had a bad trip. So
from your experience, Mark, do have people that have been on your show related very negative experiences with near-death?
Not in terms of, you rarely hear about a negative near-death experience.
Well, they're nearly all positive, aren't they?
Now, I've read of a few over the years, and they're very rare. And in my mind, the way they come through, I think that it's like, how would I describe this? I think it's used as shock, where somebody who maybe has a bad experience coming back. I mean, there are people who have the good experience who cross over, they meet loved ones, they say it's not your time, you got to go back. But maybe there's somebody in this life who's having kind of on the wrong path, and they have that massive wake-up call of a shock of something dark and whatnot, using traditional religious imagery of hell and demons and whatnot to scare the living crap out of the person to straighten out their life.
That probably happens. Yeah,
that probably happens, because I personally don't believe in a hell. I think that we do enough of that here. Hell is our own creation, but I think that we're also here learning lessons too, and I think every now and then they just like throw a little whammy at somebody to try to get them to wake up and straighten up their life. So
that's probably true.
Now we've had plenty of negative experiences in dealing with the paranormal and what Irene and I do. Irene especially has dealt with some very negative things over the years, but when it comes to in a hospital situation or a near-death experience, no, it's very rare.
And that's what I found too. Literally no one has told me a negative experience, including the palliative care doctors and the hospice doctors. So that's very interesting.
Now, with a lot of the stories that you've heard of, what would you say was one of them? And again, we want people to read the book, so we don't want to spoil too much of it. But what was one of the more memorable experiences that you had somebody tell you about?
Probably two. One I experienced myself, and then one that was told to me at the very beginning. And this, along with that Dr. Mokel near-death experience, really, this is what actually pushed me over to starting to write this book. And this was a story from Steve Heim. Dr. Heim is an orthopedic surgeon also, who is a trauma surgeon. And Dr. Heim is incredibly athletic. He still can do, at age 60, 1,000 push-ups and 1,000 sit-ups, which is about 999 more than I can do. And he tells me a story about being really stressed out over a couple months and decided to take a quick vacation to ski in Colorado. So he was skiing with his wife and his wife's sister, and they were coming down this mountain they'd never been on before. And when they got to the top of the mountain, the blizzard hit, and the temperature dropped precipitously. The snow started to come down like crazy. It was coming down with the wind blowing sideways and upside down, and they could hardly see anything in front of them. And they had to ski down because that was the only way to get down the mountain. So they started to ski. And like I said, they could only see about 10 feet in front of them. And about halfway down the mountain, they came to this patch of trees, and they had to go to the right or the left. These are pine trees in this ski run. And so Dr. Heim went to the right, and the girls happened to go to the left. And they didn't realize that they were separating until about 1 minute, until they all of a sudden, the girls weren't with Dr. Heim, so he decided, being an expert skier, to ski through this 5 feet of powder snow through the trees, through the forest, to get to the other side to meet up with the girls. So as he was doing this, he all of a sudden had this really, really strange feeling that there was something awful happening. And you know how you get that feeling in your chest? Have you ever felt that, where you know something?
Like an intense anxiety and pressure, yes.
And all of a sudden, at the same time, everything became quiet. Despite the wind blowing and howling and the trees going back and forth with the wind and the snow coming down, it was silent. And he could hear his breath. He could hear the crunch of snow underneath his skis. And he had this feeling that he had to stop skiing. So he did. And he knew the girls were probably waiting on the other side for him, but he just had to stop right in the middle of this big grove of tall pine trees. And he took off his skis, and he stood there for a minute not knowing what to do. And again, he had this feeling that there's something of life and death proportion that he was being called to do, but he didn't have any idea what it was. So he took off his skis, and then he felt like he had to climb up the mountain in the opposite direction from where the girls were waiting for him. So he's climbing and walking and climbing and walking. And he came to a large pine tree right in front of him, about 100 feet from where he stopped skiing. And when you have a large amount of snow, there's a thing called the tree well, which goes down to the base of the tree, and then it comes up on the side where the 5 feet of snow is. And he looked down into the tree well in this tree that was right in front of him, and he suddenly realized why he was there. There under the tree was a body covered with snow. You couldn't see the body unless you were right on top of the tree. He would miss it unless, if he was 10 feet away, he'd have missed the body.
Wow.
Well, Dr. Heim is a trauma surgeon, so he knew exactly what to do. What better place for a trauma surgeon to be than a major trauma of a body underneath a pine tree? So he realized that this fellow was skiing in the snow with the blizzard that had hit. He must have hit the tree, was knocked unconscious, was under the tree. Well, he brushed off the snow off his head, and he looked like he was dead. He had a gray face, didn't look like he was breathing. But Dr. Heim, being a trauma surgeon, reached for the carotid artery to see if he had a pulse. And sure enough, he had a thready pulse. It was just barely palpable, but he had a pulse, so he knew he was alive. So he suddenly went into the trauma mode. He brushed all the snow off, took off 2 of his jackets, covered him up, started yelling for help. One of the last skiers down the mountain heard his cry for help and came to his side, and he said, "What can I do?" And he said, "As soon as you can get to the phone or get to the ski lodge, call the ski patrol, get him up here. This fellow's almost dead." So in the meantime, he splinted the guy's leg, since it was a 90-degree angle, with his underclothes and some of his tree branch that he used as a splint. And about 15 minutes later, he saw the light from the snowmobile coming, pulling a gurney, and they loaded this unconscious, hypothermic, shocky skier onto the gurney, took him down to the lodge where the ambulance was waiting, and took him off to the hospital. At this point, Dr. Heim was quivering with adrenaline and cold. He got his jackets back on and hurried up and skied back to where the girls were still waiting for him, interestingly, on the other side of the grove of trees, and they all skied down to the lodge. There he got his reward, a cup of hot chocolate. The next day, he called to the hospital to find out what happened to the skier. And he said, the guy is awake, he's alert. The orthopedic surgeons that saw his broken leg were impressed with your splinting in the field. They didn't have to move any bones at all. You did all the work already for them. Congratulations. And he's perfectly healthy. And I said to Steve, Dr. Heim, I said, what did you think about that? And he said, that day, 2 people were saved. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, the skier was saved, but I was saved too. And I said, well, how were you saved? And he said, 2 years before this, my father and I were skiing in Michigan, cross-country skiing. My father's an expert skier, and he arrested on the course. And I grabbed him and rushed him down to the first aid station, which was not very far away, because Steve actually literally picked him up. They did CPR for an hour, and his father died. And Steve said to me, I felt the guilt of his death because I don't lose lives. I'm a doctor that saves lives. And I felt personally responsible for his death. And when I found this skier that had hit the tree that I was able to save, I think that was my second chance. And the guilt that I had all these years, these last couple years, totally disappeared because I realized that someone upstairs, he said, was giving me a second chance, and I succeeded. And that now I realize that life and death is not under my purview. Someone else is in charge of life and death, and that my second chance was saving this hapless skier that hit the tree. And when I did, 2 lives were saved. My guilt disappeared, and I was saved, and the skier was saved. And I thought that was quite a story. And I said to Dr. Heim, "Do you think your dad had anything to do with this?" And he said, "Yeah, I think he was in the plot." So that was one of my favorite stories, and that's quite a moving story. And,
that's a lovely story.
Yeah, and so Dr. Heim doesn't tell that story. He hadn't told that story to very many people, but it was quite an experience. And he said, "If you don't believe in something that's higher than us after a story like that, I don't know what you believe." So it's kind of cool. That was one of my favorites.
Scott, I just want to make one comment, and that is,
sure.
We've done a lot of interviews over the years and talking to people about the paranormal or experiences. And, in the media right now, paranormal is very popular, and there's a million TV shows, and they all focus on the negative. They all focus on the scare, the chill factor, and while I certainly don't look at things at the whole love and light thing a lot, I try to be very grounded in the middle. It's very refreshing for us to do a show and talking about these stories and coming out of it feeling good. It's a rarity, and I'm thoroughly enjoying this tonight because of
thank you.
The positive feelings and emotions coming with this show and hearing these stories.
Well, I think the doctors, again, wanted to get these stories out because they wanted to give people hope. And I just collected the stories. These are just random stories that I happened to hear from the doctors. So I just included, like I said, the ones that emotionally moved me the most. And every one is uplifting and full of hope, and that there is something else out there. And I think it's because there is. I think these stories are the way they are because I think they're true stories. These are doctors that I've known. Some of them I've known for 30 years, and I know what kind of people they are. And these are doctors that don't tell crazy stories. As a matter of fact, again, like I said, they were hesitant to tell the stories in the first place because they thought they'd be criticized. So they had no reason to tell these stories to get any gain themselves. So they didn't make any money doing this. They were all afraid that they would be criticized once the book came out, which is just the opposite has happened. So I think there's something to this, and I think it's because they're true, and these things do happen to people. And I'm hopeful that the people listening to this show will think about their own lives and realize that there are things that happen to them, like what happened to these doctors, and realize there is hope in this world. There's a lot of bad stuff that happens in this world, and I hope that people realize there is hope. There's something higher than us that looks out for us, and that love is the most powerful force in the universe. And that's my story. That's what I hope to relate.
And you're sticking to it.
I'm sticking to it.
The other thing I'm very curious about, in most of these stories dealing with loved ones, or like that last story where it seemed like a positive higher power coming in and saving a life. But did anybody ever have an experience with something else, not negative, but just something else that may have seemed off the wall? Like maybe they went somewhere else that we wouldn't consider a heaven or hell, but just an unusual experience. And I'm asking that for a reason, but I just wanted to see what you had to say first.
Let's see. Let me think about going somewhere else. I can't think of one where they ended up in a different location. I may come up with something in a minute here. But,
well, maybe this will help clarify. And the only reason I'm asking this is that there are people, and this might throw a curveball for you. This may be completely out of your purview.
Sure, go ahead.
But there are people who have found, whether if they've gone under hypnosis, that they are dealing with entities that are definitely otherworldly and possibly extraterrestrial, interdimensional, and that they even sometimes find out that they are a part of these different types of entities, that if you want to look at it as a reincarnation type of thing where they agreed to come here or whatnot, and when they die, they go back to where those people are. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. John Mack, who is a hypnotherapist and wrote a couple of books on the subject before he himself passed away. And I was just curious if, and I know it's very rare, but if anybody had an experience like they were meeting with other types of entities that didn't seem to fall into what we normally think of as spiritual.
I don't think I did. I don't think I had anyone tell me a story about that kind of experience. There are lots of, like I said, premonitions, dreams, visions, being directed to do something, but nothing quite like that I can recall from the doctors, at least. So
now I have talked with several near-death experiencers who they were living ordinary lives, but they had their near-death experience, and when they came out of it, they suddenly realized that they were highly intuitive, possibly even having mediumship qualities. Did you have any of those types of stories?
Well, the one lady that had the near-death experience in the operating room came out a totally changed person. I called the story Mary's Christmas Carol because it reminded me of Scrooge and what he went through. So there were people that were definitely changed dramatically by their experience, but not where they had any medium powers or things like that. Although there was a story about Dr. Sigalov, who is a general surgeon, who had she had a couple experiences, and I think there are some people that are a little bit closer to the hereafter than some of us, and she's had a couple experiences. One, when she was a resident, she recalls that she would have a feeling, like a fluttering feeling, that she would see fluttering like feathers in front of her or something like that, and she would know that day that one of their patients would die. Now, she was on a surgical service in the inner city where people are being shot all the time, and the surgeons are the ones taking care of them. And so she would relate this experience to the rest of the resident staff, and they would dread having her have that experience because they would know that someone would die that day, that she would be able to predict that. And she had that for quite a while she was a resident. She's lost that since, but that was a little bit uneasy for her. But she had another experience, too, that was kind of interesting. And she tells an interesting story about her meeting up with a couple of patients that she knew for quite a long time. These were patients that had retired from missionary service in Africa. They were both physicians, and during the day and the week they would take care of the medical problems, and on the weekends they would take care of the spiritual problems of the people in Central Africa. When they got older, they retired and they moved back to this area, and Dr. Sigelov was taking care of the wife. And every time they came into the office, they would talk to her about how is your spiritual life and things like that, and Dr. Sigelov wasn't offended by that at all, and she knew that they were well-meaning. And Ron, the fellow, would say to her, someday we're going to show you that there is something after this life, and that there is something to this spirituality. And Dr. Sigelov would say, yes, that's very nice, and she would be very very kind and nice to them. And eventually the wife got better, and she left and wasn't seen by Dr. Sigelov for a while. And then Dr. Sigelov was planning a little vacation to Tucson, Arizona, and she was flying out that next morning, and she had an emergency case to do the night before. And she did the case, and she had to go see the patient really early in the morning because her flight was leaving late morning, so she had to get in really, really early. So she was one of the first people to get into the hospital. And as she was entering the hospital, no one was around. There was a little puff of air as she opened the door. When you sometimes open the door, there's a difference in pressures, and there was a little puff of air. And all of a sudden, she saw Ron, the individual that she had been talking to in the past, that was married to the two missionaries, and he was all dressed in white and standing there smiling, and he had the smile on his face like he had accomplished his major life's accomplishment of some kind. And she thought it was a little strange, but she was so surprised by it, she said, "Hello there, friend." And then the vision disappeared. She realized that someone would laugh at her if they saw her say that. And so she looked around. She realized there was no one around in the hospital. She went on her rounds and then thought nothing more about it. She went to Tucson, turned off her pager, turned off all of her cell phones and everything so she could have 3 days of just rest and relaxation. But when she was coming back, she then turned all of her equipment back on and was checking her texts at the airport on the way back to Chicago. And interestingly, there was an email. It was from the vice president of medical affairs of our hospital, and the email read, "I'm sorry to inform you of the death of our good friend Ron," and I won't mention his last name, who served in Africa as a missionary for a number of years and who passed away suddenly on Friday morning. Dr. Sigelov got goosebumps. The time of his death was 2 a.m. When she entered the hospital, it was 5 a.m., and he was standing there looking like he had accomplished his major life goal. And indeed he had. He had shown Dr. Sigelov that there was life after death. He had died 3 hours before and appeared to her as she was entering the hospital.
That's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
So when she saw him, how did he look? Did he appear like 100% solid, like you or I?
It looked like a kind of a vision. Again, he was all dressed in white. It took her by a great surprise. He wasn't there for very long. It was just a short time, and he had this. He didn't say anything. He had a smile on his face. That was a smile of great accomplishment, she said. And I can imagine if that was the case, that he would feel pretty good about himself. She said, after that, I decided to read the Bible. And she did. And she's been a little bit different ever since that episode.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. Yeah, I can imagine that if I passed away and I came back to, like, say, Irene, the vision she'd see of me is one of... Oh, my
God, no, the thought of it.
The vision you'd see of me is one of continuously banging my head against the wall. Like, damn it.
Oh, that's funny.
These stories, it just really shows that there is so much more going on to life and we don't understand, and we get ourselves so wrapped up in politics and in what's going on with the country and finances, and people don't stop to think about the simple things in life. And life, of course, gets so complicated. People work multiple jobs just trying to put food on the table. And with dealing with medical costs that, I'll say it, in this country are just spiraling out of control with these damn insurance companies and everything else. I mean, I don't know if you can say anything on it because you're in the industry and you can't bite the hand that feeds you, but right. It just seems like it's almost impossible here in the U.S. for people to really get good medical care, especially if they're hurting. There's a crisis in this country in medical care. It's unfortunate, and hopefully we can get it solved. But it's going to take a while, I think. Yeah, when you start putting dollar values to things and people do things for profit, then that really look what that one guy did with the EpiPen. What was it, about a year or so ago? He bought it. It was at a reasonable price. Then he jacked it up to $600 a dose just because he could. And that's happened to lots of pharmaceuticals that I've observed. Insulin is another one that's gone way up in the last couple years, like 10 times. It's really amazing how much some of these medications have gone up. So it's too bad. Thanks for the NHS. That's all I can say, because my son, he's diabetes 1, and it doesn't cost him anything. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but here it's all for profit. And whenever they try to put an NHS in here, there's so many politics and so many lobbyists and things that we wind up getting Obamacare, and it doesn't help anybody. And again, that's not being a political. It's just that I would love to see an NHS type of system here, but if it could be run right without the greed getting it involved, or people, you're having a lot of problems over there with the NHS right now. They're having trouble. No, they are in need of money, I must admit, but because it just after the war, didn't it, to help people that couldn't afford medication. So they've been going a hell of a long time. It doesn't cost me a penny for my medical stuff. For my pumps are free. Everything is free. All my prescriptions are free. The only place you pay for a prescription is in England. Scotland, Wales and Ireland, it's all free. And in England you pay about £7 per item. It's hard to believe that our government could run a system, though, that would work, knowing the way the government runs things generally. Well, the last group. I think if they put the NHS into practice over there, with your country having a lot more money, it would be very, very successful. You may have to wait 6 weeks, 8 weeks for an operation if it's not a serious operation, but nothing costs anything. Yeah. It's all free. But the problem is that'll never happen over here because people make too much money on healthcare, between the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry, and even a lot of these doctors in private practices. I remember the doctor I was going to; he used to charge reasonable rates, and you could get in to see him, and then he joined with a few other doctors, opened this huge mega complex, and then you get in there. There's a million people; they can't see you. The doctor, you're lucky if you get 5 minutes with the doctor, and your bill was jacked up triple price because they had to justify the office building they bought. So it's a struggle for average people out there. Like when it's no win situation. Yeah, like when my wife and I are contractors, so we get lousy insurance. Any insurance we buy is astronomical, and so a lot of people like us choose not to go on insurance. And there was that time my wife's appendix burst. She almost died. And had no insurance. And while thankfully they were able to save her and work with her, the bill that came afterwards, we spent a long time trying to pay that thing down. Yeah. Well, anyway, that's all. That's very sad. Yeah. Sad. Yeah. And is there any more stories you got to tell us, Doctor? There's a couple more. One I particularly like about a fellow surgeon
Harold Adolph, who is one of the ultimate sappy do-gooders, I think, that I've ever met. Mm-hmm. He's a person that went in after medical school, went on to a residency that was kind of a mixed residency of every surgical specialty he could think of: gynecology, neurosurgery, general surgery, chest surgery, and he decided to go to Ethiopia to practice. And he became one of the few doctors in a particular region of Ethiopia. And it's interesting that people found out about him and were bringing their loved ones to him from all over the country, and they would walk for miles and days, and the whole family he tells a story about a whole family coming, and this is not unusual. That would be by like 10 or 15 people, and they would have the sick person on a gurney, and they would be carrying. The 4 people would take turns carrying that gurney through the jungles, through the water, through the swamps, whatever, and they would get to his clinic and his hospital, and he would then operate on them. And one of the big things that he ran into was a ruptured uterus. If you could imagine a woman trying to deliver a baby and then could not for days, and the uterus would sometimes rupture, and they would hemorrhage, sometimes to death. And so when that person showed up at his doorstep, they would require emergency surgery. So he did this for 7 months, and he became absolutely exhausted because you can imagine being on call 7 days a week, having these absolute life-threatening emergencies that you had to take care of in the middle of the night or whenever.
Oh, it must have been terrible.
Yeah, can you imagine living like that? So he became so exhausted that he decided he would quit. And he was a pretty religious individual. So one morning, and he would pray every morning for guidance and so forth. And one morning, he canceled his usual humble prayer, and he said, "Father in heaven, if I can't have a good, well-trained surgeon to help me today, I have to leave. I will not be able to stay." He was just absolutely at his wit's end. So he went to the operating room that day, kind of sad about his decision to leave. And about halfway through the case, there was a knock on the door, the operating room door, and it was a wife. And his wife never comes to the operating room because she didn't like the sight of blood. She would faint at the sight of blood. So it was unusual that she would be at the operating room. And next to her was this guy that was in khakis and very unkempt hair. And Harold said, "Can I help you, dear?" And she said, "Harold, I'd like you to introduce you to Dr. Moskowitz. He's a surgeon from Brooklyn, New York, who's well-trained in multiple surgical specialties and has come to relieve you for a month while you can go on a trip." Well, Harold Adolph had weak knees because he just realized that the prayer he had said in the morning, a few hours before, had just been answered. This fellow was well-trained. He wanted to say something profound to him, but all he could say is, "Dr. Moskowitz, it's nice to see you. When I finish the case, we'll talk." And so he said, after the case was over, he said, "How did you know that I was in desperate need for someone to come and help me?" Well, Dr. Moskowitz said, "Well, about a month and a half ago, I decided to go on a mission. I decided that I've been given a great gift to be able to do the surgery that I do. And I wanted to repay at least some repay the gift back by giving to the world. So I decided to go on a mission for a month. So I didn't know where to go, so I did the scientific method. I took a map, put it on the table, closed my eyes, twisted it around 3 times, and put my finger down, and it landed on Ethiopia. So I had my secretary call the airlines to get me a flight to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. When I got there, I decided to see what hospitals were around. I looked in the phone book, called the local hospitals. He got a hold of Dr. Adolph's person in charge of the hospital. He said, "Dr. Adolph needs some help. Go see him." He flew in that morning, and he was standing there, and he was able to relieve Dr. Adolph for that month. Adolph went to a resort area in Africa where he was able to relax. He recharged his batteries, came back full of vim and vigor again. Dr. Moskowitz did a phenomenal job of taking over for him for that month, worked like a dog. And Dr. Adolph then was able to continue. And after that, he said every 6 months he would take a month off because he realized he would get so burned out. And he was able to stay in that mission and do those surgeries for those poor people for 42 more years. He finally was able to retire and come into this country. But he said that was truly a miracle that kept him in Africa operating on those poor native individuals when Dr. Moskowitz showed up, totally unexpected, after his prayer to have a individual come and help him.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah,
well,
shows your prayers can be answered.
We're coming towards the end. I was going to say I think we have time for one more story.
As well.
Yeah, one more story if you have one.
Sure. This is about me. I've got a story about myself and my daughter, who is a show choir person. The show choir people are high school girls boys too, that sing and dance at the same time, which I would have difficulty doing. And there was a particular outing that we were going to in Wisconsin. We live in Illinois, and it was in Wisconsin. So the bus trip was about 5 hours, and the bus with all the girls left about an hour before we left, and we were about, like I said, an hour behind the bus. And about 2 or 3 hours into the trip, we got a call from my daughter, and she said, "Dad, there was a little tiny fire on the bus, but there's no problem, and we'll see you at the hotel." So we thought nothing about that. And about an hour later, when we would have caught up to the bus, we could see on the rise of the hill, there were all these fire trucks and police cars, and the blockade, the exits were blockaded out. And as we passed, we noticed that there was a bus on fire, flaming with smoke billowing out of it. And my wife said, "That's Lucci's bus." That was my daughter's bus.
Oh my God.
It was totally incinerated.
Yeah.
And we got her on the phone again. She said, "Well, Dad, the coach told me not to tell you how bad it was. We didn't want you worried."
Did everyone get off?
That's the interesting part of the story. The bus caught on fire when a tire blew out in the back, and they didn't realize it until the bus started to catch on fire from the friction from the tire. And then when they realized that, the bus driver pulled off at that exit. And all the girls started to scream because the bus filled with smoke. Flames were licking up around the side of the bus. It went very, very rapidly. And the girls were screaming, trying to get out of the bus. They couldn't see anything because there was smoke throughout the bus. The floor was getting hot. The girls that didn't have shoes on had to jump around because the floor was hot from the flames underneath the bus. It was like a giant flaming coffin. And all of a sudden, according to the girls that were and the boys that were in the bus behind, it was like a giant hand went over the bus. The flames died down. That allowed all the girls to exit the bus on the one exit in the front. And when the last girl jumped off the bus, there was a roar of flames from the back of the bus that swept through the bus, incinerated everything in the bus, including their clothing, their luggage, everything was burned up. So there they are. No girl was injured at all. And they think, in the bus behind, they think that was the most incredible miracle that they've ever seen. Unfortunately, everything was burned up. They got into the hotel when the second bus arrived to take them about 2 o'clock in the morning. And then the choir director, who was a little young and inexperienced, said to us, "We're going to go on anyway at 11 o'clock in the morning." This was 2 a.m. We were going to go on with no clothes, no costumes, no makeup, no nothing. Well, then started the series of events that were just also kind of amazing. The principal of the high school, our high school, had the keys to the high school, and they found there were 52 girls. They found 26 costumes in one of the lockers that were stored there. They brought those to the Wisconsin site. And then in the morning, they found 26, interestingly, what a coincidence, 26 other costumes that were sequined just opposite color. One was purple and one was silver. They were almost matching identically. My wife was in charge of costuming. Isn't that incredible?
That's amazing.
Exactly 52, half and half.
Exactly 52 costumes. Half were purple, half were sequined silver. And my wife, who again was in charge of costuming, was frantic trying to get duct tape, pins, all the stuff. Throughout the night, the parents had gone to the Walmart locally, the local store, and purchased, which is open 24 hours, purchased all the undergarments and everything else. And with duct tape, pins, and everything else, they were able to fit their costumes, and they were ready to go on. The only thing they didn't have was shoes. And what happened then was also an interesting miracle. People would just show up and say, "Take my shoes. You can use my shoes." And they were able to find 52 pairs of shoes for the girls to go on. They went on at 11 o'clock when they were supposed to go on. They announced what had happened. There wasn't a dry eye in the house after they sang. And one of the songs that they sang was a song about overcoming adversity and tragedy and moving on and living through it, which is an interesting coincidence that they happened to sing that song at this very time. The audience...
Sorry, I was just going to say it's incredible, yeah.
The audience was in tears over the whole affair. Then came the award ceremony at the end of the whole ceremony, and they announced the third place winner. We didn't win third place. Second place winner, we didn't win. First place winner, we didn't win that. But the girls were resigned that they had done the best they could with what they had. And then someone came on the stage with a trophy that was about 5 feet high for the grand champion. We were announced as the grand champion. We won it all.
Wow. That is amazing.
So that's an event that I will never ever forget in my whole life. And after the award ceremony, everything, my daughter, we got together. We didn't say a word. We just hugged each other because she was alive. None of the girls were hurt, and we took it all.
Wow. Oh, my gosh.
You know...
You see that in movies, don't you? But,
Yeah.
I was just going to say, who's up there scripting this? I mean, it's incredible.
I think it was scripted from above. It was you couldn't reproduce this and gotten all the parts together and did that without some external help, you might say.
Certainly had some guardian angels.
I think so. And they sang. I still have a copy of. I took a video of their song, and it just still brings me waterworks in my eyes when I watch that and think about what happened that in that 24-hour period.
Yeah. Well, I've actually seen a lorry where the tire's gone, and it's caught on fire. And I tell you what, this big articulated lorry was wiped out in no time.
It was
the fire
very quick.
just rages. So bus is as big, bus is quite a big vehicle as well. So
yes.
Now, when they said that when the bus caught on fire, they said it was like a hand came down. What produced that imagery? Did they actually see something or?
No, they didn't see anything. These were the kids. There were two buses on the trip, and the bus behind was the bus that was watching this whole thing and taking some pictures. I've got some amazing pictures of the fire, and they said that the flames just seemed to abate enough time that the last girl was able to jump off the bus. And literally, the coach said when she jumped off, the choir director said when she jumped off the bus, they could hear the roar of flames, and that ripped right through from the back of the bus to the front, and it incinerated everything in the bus.
Wow!
It was just. Everyone that was there that had seen that said this was just a miracle that all these girls came out safely without anyone being harmed at all.
Certainly was.
Yeah, and what gets me and what makes me question is when they choose to do something like this, to save a bunch of girls on a bus from a terrible fire, and yet we still have other atrocities that happen across the world. I mean, sometimes you wonder what makes things happen. Why do they step in and save these people rather than these people? I think
that's a good question, Mark, and I've had that question asked to me a number of times, and I think the answer. I was able to get the answer on a TED Talk. There was a TED Talk that I heard, and there was a minister from England that talked about this. And he said he went through the whole litany of how, like in the tsunami in Malaysia, how some of the people had a Sunday service that they decided to have in the mountains and not on the beach for some reason that particular day, and why those people were saved and not others. And his conclusion was, he said, I have the definitive conclusion. And the conclusion is, we don't know. Someday we might, but we don't know now. And I think that's the only thing we can say, that some people are saved for some reason and other people are not. And I don't know why, and I don't think anyone does.
That's true. No, that's true. In every tragedy, there's a miracle. Miracle comes out of every tragedy, Mark.
Yep. Yep, it does.
If you really look for it, it does.
Well, our guest tonight has been Dr. Scot J. Kolbaba, and the book is Physicians' Untold Stories, Miraculous Experiences Doctors Are Hesitant to Share with Their Patients or Anyone. Scott, where can people find your book?
Primarily on Amazon is the best place. They're available through other sources, but Amazon's probably the best.
And do you also have a website or somewhere where people can reach out to you if they had
Yes.
more stories to share?
Yeah, we have a website. It's physiciansuntoldsstories.com, and they can. I'd love to have other stories. We're looking at doing a TV show. We're working with a film producer in New York, and so I'm interested in any other stories that doctors, nurses, or anyone would have. I don't want to take away from your book, but we're mostly interested in the medical profession, but looking for any stories in that arena.
Well.
If we hear of any, we'll pass them over to you.
That'd be great. That'd be great. Thanks, Irene.
And Scott, I will tell you, I did buy the book, so I'm starting to read it. So,
Thank you.
well, thank you again for being. This has been a great show, and we really loved having you on.
It's been a pleasure, Mark, and thanks, Irene, so much.
And thank you for coming.
And want to thank all of our listeners. Thank you for listening to another Paranormal UK Radio here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. And, you can find us everywhere. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, you have to say that because there's so many places we can't remember them.
But thank you, everybody, and we'll catch you next week. Irene, we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, okay. Bye, everyone.